PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors on Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk about the Delaware River Campaign during the American Revolution with Michael Harris, the author of Fighting for Philadelphia.
This week on PA Books, Michael Harris, author of Fighting for Philadelphia.
Michael Harris is the author of Fighting for Philadelphia. In your book, you write about the Delaware River Campaign from October to November 1777. How has that campaign been viewed by historians?
It's often overlooked. It's a major aspect of the 1777 campaign, but it usually gets short shrift in most of the books. They might cover all the operations in maybe a chapter or less, but it's pretty significant considering how it's been overlooked. Yeah.
Now, I think a lot happened before the campaign begins, and we can't cover everything there. Yeah. But set us up a little bit. Where are we when we get to early October 1777?
Yeah, so just a quickie overview of it is the armies had moved from northern New Jersey beginning in the early summer of 1777. British by sea, the Americans by land, eventually ending up in northern Delaware. You have a minor engagement down there in early September at a place called Couch's Bridge. Then the big battle at Brandywine, which is basically Chad's Ford area today, on September 11th. That leads to Washington needing to defend the Schuylkill River, which leads to engagements known as the Battle of the Clouds and Paoli. And Washington keeps losing. And the British eventually end up in what was then a village of Germantown outside of Philadelphia after they had occupied the city. But how that sets up the fighting on the Delaware River is even though the British captured Philadelphia on September 26, 1777, they don't control the river. The Americans had a series of fortifications and obstructions and naval elements that prevented British naval access to the city, which creates a major problem for William Howe, the British commander, because he can't get food into the city for not only his army, but the civilian population. And so by the first week of October, there becomes a whole series of operations from William Howe to get that river opened up to his fleet.
So as George Washington he's kind of recovering from this series of defeats and the loss of Philadelphia.
Sure.
How does he begin to develop a plan for the river?
He kind of goes at it piecemeal. He's hesitant to commit large numbers of troops to these river operations because he's got this constant fear that William Howe will come out of Philadelphia and attack his main army. So he's very hesitant to detach troops. In fact, in the early stages, it's very small. It's just a few hundred guys that he detaches. And he becomes increasingly reliant on reinforcements coming down from the Hudson River Valley, whether they were troops guarding the Hudson Highlands or once the Battle of Saratoga concludes in mid-October, Horatio Gates sending his army down to reinforce Washington. And until that, he is very hesitant to get too involved on the river or even go there himself to be involved in the operations.
How did the British dependence on the Royal Navy for supplies impact how they operated?
It was a major issue, right from the very beginning. Throughout the war, the British are heavily reliant on supplies from Europe, from England. And so they're very hesitant to go too far from navigable waterways where their fleet could get them supplies. It's why when he lands in the upper Chesapeake early in the campaign, he almost immediately starts to make a beeline for Philadelphia as opposed to raiding the Pennsylvania backcountry, Lancaster, York, Reading, because he wouldn't have had river access for his fleet. So it's a major issue, and it becomes an issue throughout the campaign because Hal is very lacking fresh supplies, even livestock. And so there's multiple times in the campaign he has to stop for 4 or 5 days and raid the countryside until he gets to Philadelphia proper. But then he still has a problem because the fleet can't get into Philadelphia.
Yeah. Why was he so fixated on Philadelphia? It was the rebel capital, but Continental Congress had moved to York. The Continental Army was still in the field, so he had the capital, but...
Yeah, it's one of the great mysteries. We don't know 100% for sure. Really all we have from William Howe is his official writings to the king, which are these official reports, basically, and his testimony to Parliament when he goes home after this campaign's over. His personal letters are lost. His wife burns them after he dies. So a lot of it's a mystery. But he becomes fixated on Philadelphia in late 1776. As he's defeating Washington all around New York City, he pushes Washington out of New York. And up prior to the Battle of Trenton, he thought the Continentals are done, and in the spring he was going to be able to capture Philadelphia and the war would be over. He becomes fixated on it for reasons that aren't entirely clear. And so then when the spring rolls around, he was supposed to move north to aid John Burgoyne's effort as John Burgoyne's coming out of Canada that in the spring of 1777. But William Howe is so fixated on Philadelphia that he says, well, I could go capture Philadelphia and get back in time to aid Burgoyne. But almost every decision he makes that more and more impossible as the months tick by. And he never does get back to John Burgoyne. John Burgoyne ends up surrendering at Saratoga.
So let's look at the river defenses. How are they structured? Because there are a few different elements. There's the chevaux de frise, there are the forts, and then there was the naval aspect.
Yeah, it's kind of complicated. And it depends on what point in the campaign we're talking about. But if we want to focus on, say, mid-October, by that point, the river defenses are pretty much intact. Earlier in the campaign, say late July, the only true defenses were the chevaux de frise, these obstructions sunk in the river. And so if you could imagine a log cabin without a roof, and these metal-tipped logs sticking out of them, and then they're filled with stone, so they sink in the river, and then these bins are chained together. And there were 3 rows of them in the river. One row roughly where the Commodore Barry Bridge is today, near Chester, and then 2 more rows up closer to Philadelphia, roughly where the Philadelphia airport area is today. They were true obstructions, and they were in place before the end of July 1777. And then there's eventually going to be 3 fortifications, and the purpose of the 3 fortifications was to prevent the British from removing those obstructions. So they were meant to shell any operations or bombard any operations trying to pull those obstructions out of the way. And so there's 2 on the New Jersey side and 1 on the Pennsylvania side. The farthest south on the New Jersey side was a place called Billingsport. It's roughly where Paulsboro, New Jersey is today. And that was meant to defend the lower line of obstructions down there, roughly where Chester is. Then up north, also on the New Jersey side, basically directly across from where the Philadelphia airport is today, was Fort Mercer. And that was to defend those upper obstructions. Now, Billingsport and Fort Mercer are not even built till late September, early October. And then there's one on the Pennsylvania side, Fort Mifflin, which has got a complicated history. It goes well into the 20th century. But prior to the war, the Pennsylvania Assembly had paid for the land that the fort sat on and brought in a British engineer officer, John Montresor, to create a defensive point and a point for collecting trade duties for the British government, like in the 1760s. And then they start building this thing in 1771. But the time that construction ends, they had only built 2 walls and some barracks. So you got to kind of imagine a backwards L, where you had 2 stone walls facing downriver, but the land side was exposed. There was no defensive works on the land side. And that's the state of the fort when the American Revolution begins. And there were no troops in it at that point. And then as the Philadelphia campaign is escalating and continuing, they start to build wooden palisades on the land side to enclose the fort, and they built these wooden blockhouses. Also keep in mind at the time it sat on an island known as Mud Island, and it wasn't connected to the mainland as it is today if you go visit the site. And so ultimately you have these 3 fortifications by, say, early October, mid-October, to defend these lines of obstructions. And then you have the further complication of naval elements. And there were 2 naval elements. There was Pennsylvania Navy, which were naval militia that reported to the Pennsylvania Assembly, almost like infantry militia, same idea. And then there were some Continental Navy ships in the river too. And complicating it even further, the Commodore in command is a Pennsylvania naval officer, not a Continental naval officer. So you have this command dynamic where you have Continental Navy command officers having to take orders from a Pennsylvania state officer, which creates some issues as the campaign goes on. And then you also have these Continental officers that report to Washington in the fortifications having to work with this Pennsylvania naval element, which creates a lot of issues as this river fighting continues in the mid-November. Yeah.
So the Pennsylvania Navy, these were not ocean-going ships, right? These were designed for the Delaware River.
Yeah, there were a few larger brigs included in that force that were probably capable of coastal operations, but these weren't like ships that could cross the ocean, like the British naval ships that are going to be bottled up in the river trying to break through all of this defenses.
And so a lot of these are galleys that are rowed.
Yes.
And
one gun, small.
And they also have fire rafts.
Yes, which would have basically rafts with combustibles on them, and they would set them on fire and send them down river like adrift, trying to bump into the British naval ships and catch them on fire. That was the idea behind them, but not one of them worked.
So let's go to the British side of things. So they're looking downriver at all these obstructions and defenses, blocking the Royal Navy from arriving in Philadelphia. What kind of strategies, how proceed with?
Well, he's going to take it step by step. So step 1 is he's got to get the lower obstructions down there where Chester is removed first. And so to do that, they have to take out this fortification at Billingsport on the New Jersey side. So that has to be step 1. And that actually begins a little bit before the fighting at Germantown. On October 4th is the Battle of Germantown. But on October 1st, William Howe detaches 2 regiments from the Germantown camp, the 10th and 42nd Regiments of Foot, to march to Chester, be rowed across the river by the Navy that has now returned from the Chesapeake Bay, and march inland on the New Jersey side and attack this fortification. And that attack will take place on October 2nd. And there's, oddly enough, Pennsylvania militia in that fort, not New Jersey militia, that are driven away and rescued by Continental Marines and rowed to safety at Fort Mifflin. And once that fortification is captured, that's when the British Navy is able to start the slow process of removing the obstructions that were down there where Billingsport was. But it's going to take them almost 3 weeks to make an opening before they can start to snake their ships through that opening that they're going to make.
So what's happening in Philadelphia at this time? Are they really struggling with food and supplies?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. Washington, throughout earlier in the campaign, had given orders to remove the grinding stones from all the grist mills in the area. So even though Howe's out with these foraging expeditions capturing grain from people's farms, they can't process it in the flour. So they're heavily reliant on supplies from the Navy. And once he gets Philadelphia, the only way to get supplies up is a circuitous wagon path from Chester up to Philadelphia that the Pennsylvania militia is constantly raiding and causing problems for Howe's supply line. So he's very pressed to get the ships up and the flow of supplies. Because it's not just the Army. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but I want to say there's like 15,000 civilians in the city too that also are now on short rations and lacking food. So it's a major issue.
Did Washington and his team Were they planning to hold out indefinitely, or did they know that there was a time limit to how long they could hold?
From Washington's point of view.
Yes.
So I actually think, again, it doesn't come right out in any of the writings of the documents, but I actually think Washington's trying to repeat what he did at Boston, where he eventually starved the British out of Boston through the siege operation. So I think what was the plan is control the roads on the north side of Philadelphia. And you got to remember that Philadelphia in the 18th century sits on a peninsula where you've got formed by the Schuylkill and the Delaware rivers. So 18th century Philadelphia only went from South Street to Vine Street and from river to river. And so it was this rectangle. So if you could control the roads on the north side of the city, which is part of why I think he attacks Germantown, is to get control of the roads on the north side of the city. And then you could control the river, which he is by early October. The theory, I think, was starve them out, like we did at Boston. And ironically, we'll get to this later, if the river fortifications held out for another week or two, the river would have froze over and it would have worked. I think that was the long-term plan over those few months. Yeah.
Now let's talk about Commodore Hazelwood. He was the leader of the Pennsylvania State Navy, but he would oversee the Continental forces as well.
Yeah.
Who was he?
He is John Hazelwood's his name. He was hired by the Pennsylvania State Assembly to command this ad hoc force of hodgepodge of types of ships, from galleys to brigs to fire ships to supply ships, and defend the Delaware River. And they were in operation almost from the war's beginning, raiding British blockade ships in 1776, helping the Trenton and Princeton operations in the winter of 76 and the 77. He's in charge of all that. And so when this stuff starts to develop in the summer and early fall, he's the highest ranking naval officer on the river, even though he's a state officer. So there are continental officers on the river, but they don't have as much rank or experience on the river as he does. So Washington ends up okaying this state officer superseding continental officers because of his experience and his rank on the river.
And on the Army side, was there a single commander in charge of the troops in the forts?
Theoretically, yes. Eventually, it's going to be James Varnum. Eventually, but he doesn't even arrive on the scene until late October. I'm trying to remember my dates here. So the initial fighting down there around these forts, it's individual fort commanders running the show. There's no overall head in charge. But it'll eventually be James Varnum, who's a brigade commander in the Continental Army. But again, I don't remember the date off the top of my head, but he doesn't arrive till, I want to say, late October 1777, and then he tries to command from the New Jersey side when all this is going on. Yeah.
Now, early on in this process, there's some of the Continental and Pennsylvania State Navy ships start to approach Philadelphia, and they end up losing one of the ships. So what happened? So
that is the day after the British occupy Philadelphia. So this would be September 27th. The American fleet is basically anchored down near where Fort Mifflin is. So again, down there where the airport is today. And I don't think because of the way the river bends there, they couldn't see I don't think they knew the British had occupied the city. Because they're cut off from Washington. They're isolated by a roundabout route to get information from George Washington. And so the naval elements under Hazelwood, they go upriver. Actually, Hazelwood orders them to go upriver, some of his ships, to scout out the situation in Philadelphia. And they end up getting into a firefight. The British had planted some batteries on the wharves of Philadelphia, and this little firefight develops on basically down near where South Street is today, is roughly where all this goes on. And the largest ship of the American fleet, the Delaware, ironically, runs aground. and the commander, Captain Alexander, ends up striking his colors and surrendering the ship. And the British end up getting control of that ship. They get it off the sandbar and they repair it, and it becomes the largest ship the British have north of the obstructions. Because remember, the rest of the fleet's still stuck downriver. It's actually kind of a disaster for the Americans that day. Yeah.
So with the Americans controlling the fort at Mud Island, Fort Mifflin, how did the British start moving? They do end up moving some artillery into range of that fort. What's their plan there?
Yeah, so after Billingsport falls, the next thing that William Howe has to deal with is dealing with the forts protecting the upper row of obstructions. And so where the airport is today, there were two islands, Carpenter's Island and Province Island. And they were basically meadows that the farmers in the area used for grazing cattle. And they had dikes that protected them from flooding. And William Howe wants to plant batteries on those islands to shell the backside of Fort Mifflin, to take out that fortification, and same idea as Billingsport, so they could start removing the obstructions. The problem that they run into pretty quickly, this starts late September, the British engineers start to try to erect these batteries on these two islands. The Americans had cut the dikes, and so these islands had flooded. And so you have British laborers and civilian laborers working in knee-deep mud, waist-deep water, trying to erect these land batteries to shell the backside of Fort Mifflin. And it's taking forever. It's a nasty process, and it's just not happening fast enough for William Howe because of the food situation. And that's why he's going to give the orders to attack the New Jersey side and try to take out Fort Mercer.
Now, there is an attempt by the Americans to attack these batteries on Carpenter's Island. On October 11th, the landing party stormed some of the batteries, and they ended up capturing prisoners.
Yeah, they have some, because they don't want them to build those batteries. And so in the early stages, when they're just getting the first couple batteries near completion, Samuel Smith, the commander at Fort Mifflin, a lieutenant colonel, he orders this attack, and the naval elements are going to row them over. And it wasn't a very long distance, so there was this back channel up the backside of Mud Island that they had to row across to attack these batteries, and they find some success. They capture them. They captured most of the guys defending these couple little readouts where these British were trying to plant these guns, and it's successful. And it makes you wonder why, as the campaign continues and they're building more and more of these batteries, why they didn't keep doing that. But it's really, they only did it that one time. And it gets back to the lack of cooperation between the Navy and the Army, is as the British get more and more batteries in place and the British naval elements get up closer to Fort Mifflin, the Hazelwood becomes more and more hesitant to risk his own ships in these landing party operations.
So you mentioned that Howe decides to make a move against Fort Mercer on the New Jersey side. Yeah. What is his plan? Why does he select that fort as the next target?
Well, because the operations to build these batteries on the Pennsylvania side is just so slow. He wants to speed up the process of opening the river up. And it wasn't a bad idea. If you take out Fort Mercer on the New Jersey side, you're taking out the lifeline for Fort Mifflin, because all the supplies and reinforcements for Fort Mifflin have to come from the New Jersey side, because Mifflin's cut off from Washington's army on the Pennsylvania side. So it made sense. And so he orders 4 Hessian regiments to ferry across to what's Camden now and march inland and then attack this fort. And they ferry over on October 21st to set up an assault on October 22nd.
Now, if we go back a few days before that, on the 17th, Burgoyne surrenders at Saratoga.
Correct.
So is that news filtering down?
It takes a while. That's a good question. I'm trying to remember the dates of when all that gets learned. Washington, I think, finds out about it first, but I don't remember the exact dates. By the end of October, Washington knows. There's a celebratory, they call it Feud of Joy, where they're firing off blank rounds in the camp celebrating it. And then Washington is almost instantly trying to get Gates to send out reinforcements from that army. It takes Howe a little longer to learn the news, and I actually think he gets it from American newspapers first. before British intelligence gets it to him. But by, I want to say early November, everybody knows.
So why were Hessians chosen for this operation against Fort Mercer?
That's a good question. The main reason is most of the Hessian troops up to that point in the campaign had not been used and had not been bloodied in a battle. Most of the British units had fought at least at one of the major battles, if not multiple: Brandywine, Germantown, Paoli, etc. But the Hessian units were, for the most part, in reserve in all those fights and were relatively fresh and unbloodied. That's part of the reason. The other reason is the Hessian officer that volunteers for this attack, Karl von Donop, has an ulterior motive of trying to regain the Hessian reputation. So the last major fight that the Hessians had kind of done on their own was Trenton, which did not end well for the Hessians. And ever since then, they were looking for an opportunity to redeem their reputation. So von Donop kind of begs for this and volunteers his command, or at least most of his command, then he gets command of this operation to be the sole force for this attack. And it will be a mostly Hessian operation with just 2 British artillery pieces accompanying them. The rest of it's a Hessian force.
Let's talk about Fort Mercer itself and how it was structured, and how did they prepare the fort for the fight?
That's a good question. So initially, it's a pretty big fort. I don't remember the exact dimensions off the top of my head, but it was a long rectangular fort with like readouts in the corners, long and rectangular, with the long side along the river. And there were only 2 regiments from the Hudson River Valley initially assigned to defend that fort. It's about 500 men under Colonel Christopher Green. There are 2 Rhode Island regiments. It's Nathaniel Green's cousin. There's a connection there. But that's not a large enough force for the size that fort was. And so when Green was sent there, he was also given a French engineer officer to help him, a guy named Thomas Duplessis. And when Duplessis gets there, he's like, this fort's way too big, which was a common theme when you read these French documents. They were always complaining that the Americans were making forts that were too big for the amount of troops they had. So what Duplessis decides to do, this is now like the second week of October, not long before the fight, he reduces the size of the fort. About 2/3 of it are eliminated, and they build a new wall for the southern third of the fort. Now the ditches for the 2/3 they abandoned, and the walls are still there, but they're not defending it anymore because they've built this new cross-section wall to separate, so if you could kind of imagine, the lower third of the fort. And so when the Hessians attack, when they attack, they think they're attacking that whole fort and not just the lower third.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
So let's start talking. Let's kind of take it through step by step. Okay. So von Donop comes up with some type of plan to attack the fort.
Yeah.
How do they implement it?
So they approached the fort early afternoon on October 22nd, I'm sorry, after marching roughly 17 miles from where they had camped the night before. And they get to the edge of this woodlot, and that's the first time they're seeing it. And first thing he does, he tries to get them to surrender. So he sends out a couple of his staff officers, and one of the only 2 British officers on this operation, a Major Charles Stewart, probably because he speaks English, he goes out with these Hessian officers to try to parlay and get the fort to surrender. But the Christopher Green's not going to surrender, so that doesn't work. So he is going to try to bombard the fort, but they have 8 light guns. These are not guns for taking down fortifications. These were light field guns. And it's an earthen fort. So these light field guns, these little 3-pounders, weren't going to do much damage to this earthen fort. And so ultimately, he's going to have to assault. Because if he doesn't assault, he's going to get a lot of blame from the British. Many of his officers tried to tell him, you shouldn't assault this thing. But von Donop's kind of arrogant. The last time the Hessians had assaulted a fort in the war was at Fort Washington towards the end of the New York campaign in 1776, and the Americans there proved the pushover, and they captured a very large force of Americans. So they did not have a reason to fear Americans defending a fortification. And if he had not done it, he would have gotten a lot of blame from William Howe, and there would have been more blame against the Hessians, etc. So he is going to, he's got 4 regiments with him. He's going to use 3 to assault the fort, 1 from the north, 1 from the east, and 1 from the south, and keep 1 in reserve. And after just a 15-minute bombardment with his light artillery pieces, he orders these 3 regiments forward. And that's his plan for the attack.
Now, once their artillery bombardment begins, that notifies the Pennsylvania Navy that something is going on. So how does the Navy become involved in the fight?
That's correct. Christopher Green actually uses these primitive speaking tubes to get signal out to the naval elements in the river to come closer. And they start to shell towards the woods where the Hessians were deployed. And then the northern unit, the von Minnegrode battalion that is going to sweep it from the north and attack the northern part of the fort, their flank becomes exposed to the river. And they get heavily hit with naval artillery fire coming into what would be their right flank. So the naval element plays a huge part in helping to damage these Hessian assault columns.
So as the Hessians are advancing on the fort, what kind of obstacles do they have most forts have walls, of course, but they also sometimes will have ditches?
Yeah, so this fort specifically had multiple obstructions. First, there's the ditch. An attacking force would have to come down into and then up the wall that the Rhode Islanders were defending. There was also abattis surrounding the fort, which is basically the branches off the top of trees sharpened and laid around the fort to slow down attacking elements. There was also fray, just spelled Fraise. It's a French term. And those are like logs sharpened and that are in the outer walls, and they're out at an angle to obstruct units trying to come up over the walls into the fort. And then they had also planked the exterior of the fort so that they couldn't get footholds and handholds, and it was almost smooth. All things that would slow down attackers. Now, the Hessians did not bring scaling ladders. They did make, I can't think of the word now, fascines, which are these bundles of sticks tied together. And as they went into the attack, they throw these bundles into the ditch. The idea being is that you can then run across the ditch, because then you're kind of leveling the playing field, so to speak. But because of that abandoned part of the fort, they threw their fascines in the abandoned part of the fort. And when they got into the abandoned part of the fort and realized that there was another wall they were going to have to cross and another ditch, they had already used their fascines.
So as the Hessians are now moving their way into this abandoned part of the fort, how does the fight unfold there?
They get eviscerated. So they swing into they actually think they had won. When they get into the abandoned port, they actually, part of the fort, they actually cry out victory. Then they realize that they hadn't won. And when they start to sweep through the abandoned part of the fort to attack where the Rhode Islanders were, they're not only getting hit by those naval elements on their flank, but the Rhode Islanders literally laid their muskets on the top of the fort. And as the Hessians approached the abattis that they had to pass through to get to the wall, they're eviscerated. And there's bloody, tangled mass ends up all caught and tangled in the abattis. It's where Carl von Donop goes down with a leg wound, actually, leading that one battalion. And the Americans are able to shift within their smaller fort from one wall to another as these Hessian elements are approaching from 3 different sides. And it just keeps repeating itself around the 3 sides of the fort. And they're going to be bloodily repulsed. It's heavy casualties for these 3 Hessian regiments.
How long does this battle last?
Less than 40 minutes. It's over pretty quick.
And at what point do the Hessians start to withdraw?
Oh, it's pretty quick. Basically, once they get shot down in the abattis, and there's a few that get down into the ditch and try to climb the wall, but they're going to be shot down. So I would, if I had to put a number on it, within 25, 30 minutes of the fight, they're falling back because they just can't get close enough to these walls without being shot down.
So what's the British response to this defeat?
There's, again, going to be some blame put on the Hessians, but as a result, they're going to now have to heavily focus on Fort Mifflin. With that failed attack on the New Jersey side, they're going to have to ramp up operations on the Pennsylvania side. And then actually the very next day, October 23rd, enough British ships had gotten through the opening down at Billingsport that a naval bombardment erupts on the river the next day as the British ships try to shell Fort Mifflin. And that turns into another disaster for the British.
Well, let's talk about that part of it. The HMS Augusta and the HMS Merlin are heavily involved in this. What happens?
So they end up in the middle of tacking in the position to try to shell either Mercer or Mifflin. Both the Augusta and the Merlin ran aground on a sandbar. And they're going to try throughout the day to try to lighten the ship, both those ships, and they're trying to tow them off the sandbars, but they're stuck. They can't get them off. Meanwhile, the Fort Mifflin and Fort Mercer are pounding these British ships. The naval elements are swarming around because they have these lighter, shallow draft, galleys that can swarm around these ships. They're launching fire rafts, and then eventually the Augusta catches fire. And there's a lot of myth out there of what caused that ship to catch fire, but the truest version of it, which can be found in the court-martial documents, is Royal Marines that were on the Augusta were shooting at these naval elements swarming around them, and the sparks from their flintlocks set the hammocks on fire inside the ship, and then the hammocks fire spreads throughout the ship, and it eventually causes a massive explosion on the Augusta, like mushroom cloud size. It was heard as far away as Lancaster. It shattered windows in Philadelphia. And the ship blows up. And then as a result of that, the Merlin is ordered, abandoned, and set on fire so the Americans can't capture that one too. Yeah.
What is the impact of the Fort Mercer defeat on the British? Was there a larger impact for that?
Not really, other than it slows down opening the river. Long term, it's not going to have a major impact. Short term, it did because it's going to take that much longer to open up this flow of supplies.
Did it on the American side? The American forces had suffered defeat after defeat after defeat. Here's finally this victory. Did it matter to them?
It doesn't really. You would think it did. I mean, there's some references if you read Ben Franklin's papers, who's at this time negotiating with France for an alliance. He references it. When he gets news of it, because it's a highlight to tell the French, look what we did, But ultimately, it's going to be, it's really Saratoga, Washington's attempted attack on Germantown. Those two are the bigger factors of getting the French alliance. Fort Mercer just gets kind of like a short mention in some of the French documents.
So you mentioned that now the British have to shift their focus to the fort at Mud Island, Fort Mifflin. What is their plan now?
Well, it goes back to what they were already starting to do before the attack on Mercer. They're going to build multiple batteries on the land side, which they're going to have completed by November 8th or 9th. They're still trying to get the British ships close enough to bombard Fort Mifflin. And it's going to be a massive bombardment, which it begins in earnest on November 10th. And then on November 15th, the British ships are now close enough. And a couple British ships actually come up the back channel, the backside of Fort Mifflin. And then by November 15th, there is this massive bombardment of Fort Mifflin. Largest concentration of artillery fire in North America until Pickett's charge in the Civil War. Just a massive amount of iron raining in on this island. There wasn't a single American gun left on its carriage. There was well over 100 American casualties. The fort was obliterated. It's a pile of rubble. And by November 15th, it's pretty much indefensible. There's the survivors would have had a tough time trying to defend that fort if the British did like a land assault, like a naval amphibious assault. And so the night of the 15th, they make the decision that they're going to have to abandon the fort. And in an act of defiance, they leave the flag flying. But the survivors are rowed across the Fort Mercer the night of the 15th. And the morning of the 16th, even though the flag's flying, the British occupy the island and take down the American flag. And that brings the fighting for Fort Mifflin to an end.
So the Continental forces are now rowed across the river to Fort Mercer. They still hold Fort Mercer. What is the significance of that fort after losing Fort Mifflin?
So it's sadly, almost pointless at this point because now the British Navy is well within range to bombard Fort Mercer. But meanwhile, towards the end of the siege of Fort Mifflin, if we want to call it that, the British have sent a sizable land force over to New Jersey. And it was a two-part force. Charles Cornwallis is sent with a significant amount of the Philadelphia garrison to Chester and ferried across and reoccupies the land where the Billingsport, the fort was. But there's also now reinforcements from New York that have arrived under General Thomas Wilson. He has several fresh British units as well as replacements for many of the British units that have been on the entire campaign. So you have this, I don't remember the exact number off my head, but I think roughly 8,000 troops under Cornwallis now operating in New Jersey. And they're going to inch their way north. And after Mifflin falls, they are going to occupy Woodbury, which is the town closest to Fort Mercer. And when that happens, Christopher Green abandons Fort Mercer because he knows he can't, his 500 guys aren't going to stand up to 8,000 British troops. So the Americans destroy the works, destroy the cannons, and abandon Fort Mercer on November, I can't remember the date. Like within a week of the fall of Fort Mifflin. I can't remember the exact date off the top of my head. And Cornwallis occupies the remains of it. And then he starts to move north because that was his goal. Like capture supplies and food from New Jersey farmers, eliminate Fort Mercer, and then come back to Philadelphia. So he maneuvers to Gloucester, which is Gloucester City today, to start ferrying these stolen supplies over to back to Philadelphia and then get his troops over to Philadelphia. And that there ends up being a fight at Gloucester on November 25th, I think is the date of that, without my notes in front of me. And Lafayette's involved with that. So, all right.
What is the outcome for the Americans of the opening of the Delaware River?
It's, well, the whole idea of starving the British out goes away. The naval elements are, for the most part, lost. So after the fall of Mifflin, but before Mercer's abandoned, Hazelwood wants to move his vessels upriver past Philadelphia to try to preserve them and hopefully have them for future operations. And while some of those elements do sneak past Philadelphia in the middle of the night, most of them are going to be noticed, and British batteries on the wharves and British naval elements open fire, and many of the American naval elements are lost that night and set on fire. And so for the most part, the Pennsylvania Navy is destroyed as a result of that.
So let's go on to the land side of things. Okay. Where was George Washington during this period?
The whole time, well, most of all this time, he is on the hills of, I call them the Whitemarsh Hills, but it's roughly where Fort Washington State Park is, the Fort Washington, PA area. There's a ridge line that runs through there made up of 3 or 4 different hills that the Army has camped on for almost a month, the bulk of the Army. And he does send some reinforcements from that force to the river, but most of the time they're camped up on these hills. And Washington never visits the river sites, at least not at this point. He does visit them over the summer before all this other stuff happened. But when all that fighting's happened, he's never there. He will send Nathaniel Greene at one point and Henry Knox and some others, but he never goes.
Yeah. And there will be an engagement at Whitemarsh following this. What happens?
So William Howe, after Cornwallis comes back, it's now early December, And the old theory was, before I started researching that, is that William Howe wanted to have one more shot at Washington before winter set in. And that was the traditional story. But when I really started to dive into it, I think it's a giant foraging operation. Howe takes like 200 empty wagons with him on this operation. Why are you taking 200 empty wagons if you're looking to fight Washington? You don't do that. That doesn't make sense. I think it's about food, and we'll get into the fighting in a second, I'm sure. But he gets out there the first night to where Chestnut Hill is, the village of Chestnut Hill is now, and he immediately sends troops back to get more food from Philadelphia because he knows the operation is going to take more than 1 or 2 days. So if it's not about food, why are you sending troops back for more food? So I really now I'm kind of convinced that if he had an opportunity to fight Washington, great, but it was really about raiding those farms in that part of what's today Montgomery County and Lower Bucks County. And the priority wasn't fighting Washington.
So how did the fight unfold?
It kind of, it's piecemeal. There ends up being like 5 separate little fights over a 4-day period. But initially, as I mentioned previously, Howe marches out to Chestnut Hill with most of his troops, almost all of them. And they set up on Chestnut Hill. And Washington's up on these hills in Whitemarsh, and he wants to probe those British lines. Because Washington actually is looking for a fight. Washington, the more I worked on this volume, he has got a very aggressive mindset through the fall of 1777, more than we usually give him credit for. He's looking for a fight, like he was at Germantown. And so he wants to see if there's an opportunity. So initially on the morning of December 5th, he sends out a Connecticut regiment backed up by some Pennsylvania militia to probe the British lines on Chestnut Hill. And they run into a fight against some Hessian Jaegers, and it's just kind of a probing attack, and they fall back. But Washington didn't get enough information. So he sends out a second element of Pennsylvania militia under William Irvine. I think it's William Irvine. I hope I have the right one. Under William Irvine, one of the Pennsylvania militia brigade commanders, to do a second probe on Chestnut Hill, and that turns into a disaster. I think it's Irvine. Irvine gets wounded and captured, and his Pennsylvania militia guys get driven back by British light infantry. And so that's all on December 5th. But what William Howe learns from Chestnut Hill is that Washington is a very strong position on these Whitemarsh Hills. If you've ever had a chance to visit Fort Washington State Park, it's a significant height. And there's a creek that runs along the bottom of it called Sandy Run, which is an obstacle for an attacking force. Washington had put Abattis in front of Sandy Run, and he has like 24,000 troops up on those hills because Horatio Gates's army from Saratoga has now joined him. So he has 8,000 more guys than he ever did at Brandywine or Germantown. It's a massive army up on these hills. And so William Howe realizes what a strong position Washington's in, and there's like 50 artillery pieces studded along these hills. And so Howe is going to revert to his favorite maneuver. He goes, well, I can't push here up what's today's Skippack Pike or the Bethlehem Pike. It's too strong there. So he's going to try to shift or flank to the north and I guess that would be east to see if he could find Washington's flank and try to get access to the Bucks County farms and forage. And so on the 6th, the night of the 6th into the 7th, he marches back into Germantown and then marches north and west up towards the Abington, where Abington, PA is today, up towards that way. And then you end up with 2 more fights on the December 7th, both on this ridge or hill called Edge Hill. One force gets attacked. So he splits off Charles Gray's brigade to come up Limekiln Pike and establish themselves on Edge Hill. And they get hit by Pennsylvania militia again and a Connecticut regiment, and they easily drive those American units away. Meanwhile, Howe with the main force goes all the way out to where Susquehanna Road is today, in Abington, and starts to move up on the Edge Hill, and he gets hit by Daniel Morgan's riflemen and Maryland militia under Mordecai Gist. And while those two elements fought okay, they were heavily outnumbered, and they get driven back. And once again, Howe gets up on Edge Hill, and he sees this strong position Washington's up. He's now on Washington's left flank, but it's still a strong position. And Howe basically has to give up because his choice now is he has to send more guys back to get more food from Philadelphia, or just give up the whole thing and bring everybody back to Philadelphia. And on December 8th, he goes back to Philadelphia.
You've written a series of books about the Philadelphia the campaign in 1777, Brandywine, Germantown, book here on the river campaign. Yeah. What drew you to this topic?
Well, it initially started, I used to work at Brandywine Battlefield when I worked for the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission. And I, obviously working there, I had to do research for the site and learn the battle. And I was also working on a master's in military history at the time. And I got laid off from that position and was changing careers and finished my master's. And my wife thought it would be a good idea if I wrote a book about Brandywine after all that. And that's how the Brandywine book happened. And then that book was really well received, and it got me thinking, do I want to keep going? And I just kept the story chronologically, and then my Germantown book, and now finally this one.
When you look at this campaign as a whole, what do you think about it? Is it, what types of conclusions do you pull from it?
Well, it's a turning point of the war, because it's important to realize that everything that's happening around Philadelphia is happening at the same time as the Saratoga Campaign. And Saratoga, rightfully so, gets a lot of credit for turning the war. But the Philadelphia Campaign is as much of a factor as Saratoga. The French documents prove that. In that sense, it's the beginning of the end of the revolution. Yes, it's going to take, 4 more years to get to Yorktown, but this was the beginning of the end, because at no point moving forward will the British Army be this big again in North America. You have an entire army that surrendered at Saratoga, and then because of the French alliance over that winter of 77 and the 78, the British are forced to send troops from here to the Caribbean to defend their interests in the Caribbean. So a lot of the regiments that fought in this campaign end up in the Caribbean. And so they never have the force again that they did in 1776 or 1777 moving forward. And that's my take from it. Yeah.
When you look at the Delaware River campaign, is there any individual who's a really interesting character for you?
Oh, well, there's a bunch. James Varnum's one. He's technically in command of all this river operation, at least from the land point of view. But he never really takes control. He lets the commanding officers in these different forts be responsible and doesn't really give them a lot of leadership or guidance, which you could argue is one of the reasons everything falls apart. There's John Montresor is an interesting guy. He's the British engineer in charge of building the batteries on the Fort Mifflin land side. And what's interesting about him is he's the same British engineer that the Pennsylvania Assembly hired to build Fort Mifflin initially in 1777. It's the same guy. There's a bunch. Johann Ewald's one of my favorites. He's a Hessian Jaeger officer. His descriptions of the attack on Fort Mercer are sad. He describes losing a lot of friends in that attack and family members. There's a bunch, but there's a few off the top of my head. Yeah.
Were residents in Philadelphia writing about the battle?
Yeah, there's several. There's a few whose diaries exist. A guy named Robert Morton, who's a loyalist, his diary exists. I can't think. There's a woman. Can't think of her name, but her diary. There's a few female diaries that come out of the Philadelphia occupation, writing about the British occupation, whose names are slipping my mind right now. And then there's several, like in the Pennsylvania backcountry. In Trapp, you have Henry Muhlenberg writing about what's going on. He's the founder of Lutheranism in America, whose son's in the Army. He talks about the troops moving through the area and the wounded moving through the area at various points in the campaign and listening to the fighting on the river because he can hear it that far away. So yeah, there's several civilian accounts out there.
If you visit the sites of these forts today, what's there?
Okay, so at Billingsport, there is a little community park run by the town of Paulsboro. And there's some monuments there, but the fort itself is long gone. But there is a little strip of parkland on the river there. Fort Mercer is run by Gloucester County, New Jersey. It's a county park. Now the earthworks that are there today are really Civilian Conservation Corps recreations from the New Deal era. I don't think too much of that is the actual original ditches, but they're in the same general area. Also, about half that fort washed away with erosion into the Delaware River over the centuries. So it's only about half the size of the original fort. And then the farm that was built on, the Whitall farm, that house is still there, and you could take tours of it. And then on the Pennsylvania side, Fort Mifflin does not look anything like it did in the 18th century. So if you ever go visit Fort Mifflin, which I recommend, it's very different than it was in the 18th century because Fort Mifflin will be an active military post into the 1950s. And so what's there now is really a War of 1812 era creation. It doesn't look anything like it did during the Revolution, but it's still a great place to go visit.
Well, we've been talking about the Delaware River Campaign with Michael Harris. He is the author of the book Fighting for Philadelphia. Mike, thanks for joining me.
No, thank you for having me.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.